I just want to discuss some geopolitical issues and primarily centred around the Russo-Ukraine conflict, where I see that going, and also what we're seeing now begin to take place, and I believe it has been ongoing for the past couple of days in Syria. With the Alawites, also Christians are being targeted as well, but that's, far more sporadic. The targeting of the Alawites, which is a splinter sect of Shia Islam. Actually, they differ quite distinctly from Shia Islam's theological interpretations, specifically of the Quran, and they're far more in line with Christianity on certain issues in terms of how they view the Abrahamic doctrines. However, they are now being systematically wiped out by HTS. And of course, HTS, which I believe HTS is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a Sunni Islamist group. It was, in fact, largely funded by Israel, because this part of Israel's geopolitical policy is to weaken all the other surrounding states, which are of course mostly Arabic. So the way that this is done is by, in essence, fomenting sectarian conflict. I mean, of course, the British, and I say British loosely, right? The British and the quote-quote British and quote-quote American empires have done the same thing. So did all of the various colonial empires. Again, these colonial empires are fundamentally, they were under the same hidden yoke of a merchant elite, right? So when I say the British Empire, it was not British. The British people did not see any of the rewards of the so-called British Empire. Neither did the Arabic subjects and Persian and what have you, subjects of the Abbasid Caliphate, see any of the rewards of the conquests of that empire, nor did any empire throughout history, its subjects, that is. They do not see the rewards because the empire itself is funded and established by a merchant elite, by a hidden empire, if you will, which is the connective common thread between all of them from day dot, from the first empires. And what it is in essence, it's them preempting the cycles of entropy or decline and collapse of civilizations, fomenting through fiat the barbarians, the potential conquerors on the hinterland of that dying empire, empowering them through funding and of course illicit funding and informational transfer as well through subterfuge and clandestine operations. Of course, they open the gates of the cities as well to these conquerors, so they can completely conquer the land without firing a shot, so to say. And I mean, this has been done since the Neo-Babylonian Empire. We have records of this, right? Of them opening the gates to the conqueror, that they fund upon the hinterland. And again, that conqueror will become the despot of a new empire. He will expand that empire's grip, or reach rather, over more and more resources for this merchant elite to exploit, parasitically of course. And they will build infrastructures of servitude and slavery, so that they may blot out all other cultures, homogenize all other cultures by a sort of materialistic and consumeristic bent. And moreover as well, they blot out the culture and the folk religion through an overarching fundamentalist one world religion that is under their deity, under the spirit that they revere, that they venerate, the spirit of their nation. So Yes, so fundamentally, I mean, of course, these empires are completely under one yoke. When there is no British Empire, or there was no British Empire, there was no American Empire, there was no French Empire, there was no Umayyad Caliphate, or the Caliphate of Cordoba, there was no Roman Empire, there was no Alexandrian Macedonian Empire. These are mere masks of a deeper and far more insidious and entrenched power that ultimately really has been in control of the world for, God, you're talking maybe 2,000-3,000 years, somewhere in between that time. Again, I'm not just stating that as a sort of theory. I have evidence to back that up, and again, that evidence is replete within the books that I've written. When you look at the information, the sort of breadcrumb trail of historical evidence that still extant within the world, of course, these individuals attempt to destroy this information, bury it, because they don't want people coming to terms with the perfidious and entrenched nature this conspiracy. I mean, that's the only way to describe it, really, isn't it? And it's quite an incredible conspiracy at that. It's I mean, it really baffles the mind just how they've maintained this longevity of the agenda and the progression of it. And it's, to be perfectly honest with you, it's hidden in plain sight. You don't really have to look very far if you have, two neurons to rub together to see this conspiracy, not just partially, but in its totality. A lot of people, though they may see that there is something fundamentally wrong with the world, they don't necessarily want to confront it, because for them to confront it takes a great degree of both emotional, spiritual, and mental exertion that can be quite fractious to one's life. It can destroy one mentally as well, psychologically, and it takes many years. I say this from personal experience. It takes many years for one to go through that process of really what is psycho-spiritual transmutation, where the curtain that power has placed there to camouflage itself and its behaviour is unveiled, and a sort of revelatory experience is undertaken, is brought forth into the person's life. Again, that is it upends one's life. I mean, there's no two ways about it. But it has to occur. If it does not occur, if one does not go through that negating experience of the caterpillar cocooning itself, and of course emerging as the butterfly, through that immersion into darkness, that immersion into the shadows that we have kept hidden beneath the conscious surface, we have to delve into our unconscious. We have to delve into the deep recesses of those subconscious thoughts and niggling ideas regarding the world. We have to confront those. Once we confront them and we integrate them within our own psyche, then of course we elevate ourselves. We emerge as something greater than the sum of our parts. However, in terms of the Russo-Ukraine conflict, what I see gradually coming about, and they have to do it in a very gradualized manner, and the reason for this is because the majority of the West, both in the US, Canada, and of course the rest of Europe and the British Isles as well, they are very much averse to war. See, I mentioned this in Why the Managerialist State Will Fail. They have no real political legitimacy. There's no real mythos or legitimizing narrative that surrounds the state. that surrounds its political overreach that we see, right? And of course, elite overreach and political overreach is something that is a fundamental indicator for civil strife. And of course, this brings us to why they would want a totalizing war, one that is really not conducted for the purposes of fighting an external enemy, but for fighting the internal enemy of potential political dissidency. And this is a real issue for them right now. And of course, the perpetual war doctrine is something that it really is, it's the program for the transition into that new world that they desire, this new order of the ages, this great work. It's fundamental, it's at the crux of the great work. They need this perpetual war doctrine, again, because it maintains this legitimacy of power, which, of course, right now, they have an absence of to a great degree. So I mentioned, are you all not realising it yet? These are controlled puppets, Trump included, chosen to psychologically prime you and ensure expediency of the agenda. This is a scientifically designed plan, a millennia or more in the making, a great work, and you will not deter it by casting worthless ballots for pre-chosen actors. People have absolutely no idea what is awaiting them in this rectification period, this transition. It will be utterly nightmarish and all-encompassing in its scope. Indeed, the programme for a third world conflict is the least of those things to come. All of this has been prefigured and mentioned in the ancient and contemporary tomes of the mystery schools and the networks who rule the world. Yet the vast majority never seem to see the truth that this is largely hidden in plain sight. It is utterly baffling. The UK and Europe are the canary in the coal mine, the bait which is to establish a narrative that shall appear to force the hand of the USA. And of course, this is why Trump is in power currently, right? It's so, when this comes about, he can just mention, oh, well, you know, that Europe have done it again, right? Like the First and Second World War, we've been roped into a European conflict, these entangling alliances, but we must, we have obligations to our European allies, and we must make good upon these promises that we gave within this alliance, right? And Trump should of course, I say should, bring more individuals into the military from specific demographics that are of course in the Zohar and Kabbalah called Edom. They are, or Esau. They are the sort of lineage of Esau, those who are naturally opposed to Jacob, and of course they must be vanquished from the world entirely prior to the onset of the Messianic age. And of course as well, that's another reason everything they do is 2 or 3 or 4-fold, right? Where the sort of chaos that they are sowing within the Middle East, that's to drive those populations. All war, of course, is for strategic population relocation and planned destruction, to bring those populations to Europe, to enhance the powder keg, if you will, and to, of course, blot out demographically these so-called, this lineage of Esau. It's mentioned in the end times that the sons of Ishmael will be like the brooms for Israel to wipe away Esau. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that the sons of Ishmael, or of course Islam, will be given some sort of preeminent status. No, absolutely not. You're the next target down the line, along with the rest of the Erev Rav. the mixed multitudes. And of course it mentions as well, this was the reason for America and its founding, that it is the Ben Salem. You can see that with Francis Bacon's posthumously published work, The New Atlantis. Of course, that's another name for the Americas, and that was published posthumously in 1627. The Secret Destiny of America by Manly P. Hall, I believe, was published in 1928, if I recall correctly. I might be incorrect there, don't quote me on that, but it mentions the same thing in that book too, that America was founded for a specific purpose in mind, and that specific purpose was to act as the Ben Salem, which is the son of Jerusalem, the mask of Jerusalem and its power, that it would be used as its military hammer, so to say, its battle axe. And it mentions, of course, in the Zohar, I believe it's also in the Old Testament too, probably is mentioned in the Talmud as well, both traditions of that, the Jerusalem and Babylonian, where it mentions that Ben Salem will do the bidding of Jerusalem in the end times, just prior to the Messianic era. And again, all of that has to be completely concluded prior to the 7th millennia Anno Mundi, which we're about 250 years off of that. So we've got another empire to go, which is why, again, empires last for about 10 generations of 25 years, or 250 years all in all. And this is why the transition to China was pre-planned as well. Prior to the transition industrially, the industrial transition and migration of all industry to China from the West, the Chinese were being brought over here to study specifically engineering and such, of course in Canada and the US as well, so that they could redistribute that knowledge to China to artificially lift them up, of course, so that they could prepare the ground for the next field and crop, by which this clique, this cabal of human farmers, and the sator, the cedar that they worship, can raise up this civilization, so that, of course, like what they're doing to us right now, eventually they can harvest that crop, that new human crop, once it grows fat and plentiful and sort of industrial base, and the fruits that it produces is bountiful enough for them to see them into the year 6000. So, of course, this mirrors the days of creation, of which there were seven. Seven, of course, it links with Saturn. It goes without saying, but in classical astronomy, Saturn was the 7th planet. It was the last planet one could see with their naked eye. So to the ancients, it was literally the final planet. If we were to view all of this as the face of a clock, Saturn would be the tip, the point of the hand of the clock, right? So it kept time. It was the father of time. It was the patient one. It was the hidden or esoteric sun as well, though that was also linked with Sirius. But there's a lot of overlap. Ultimately, these are psychospiritual concepts. They're archetypes that comprise the mosaic of the psyche of man. They're not real deities per se. They're simply placeholders for things that are largely incomprehensible and can only really be understood in a sort of phenomenal aspect, as opposed to, of course, a noumenal aspect, which to man is completely beyond his comprehension, because man perceives everything through his will, that the world itself is an extension of his will, of his innate modality of perception. So this is what all of the mystery schools are about as well. But the mystery schools as well, though they They have a real drive, a real fire. It's not just an airy-fairy thing to them, this idea. It's a way for them to control the world, right? It's a great idea. They're not a people of the book. They're a people of the idea. And they're not even of one group. They're a sort of fluid, nebulous peoples. They're a sort of super dynasty as well, and a secret society that has maintained themselves through breeding and interbreeding as well, to maintain their power, to maintain their genealogical lines at the upper ranks as well. They actually believe they're not of this planet. I know that sounds absurd, but that's what they believe. They believe there is a complete bifurcation between us, the Homo sapiens, and them. They see themselves as somewhat as godmen in that regard. Anyway, to continue on, just to find where I left off. Yeah, so it will force the hands of the USA, thus ushering in the catastrophic catalyst of the third global conflict. This shall ensure sweeping powers are snatched up by the governments of this feudalistic world system, ensuring biodigital convergence can be initiated and the world population can be ever more scientifically managed with great intensity and scope. And moreover as well, for the Europeans, you'll notice the Europeans are really pushing this. They're hammering this doggedly. They want this war. And the reason they want this war, and they want this proxy war as well, even in its sort of cold war element right now, is because it's a distraction. Because a lot of these European countries are teetering on the edge of civil war. Now, this was all by plan, and they've got contingencies in play. This is why, of course, they were putting up, you could call them extrinsic elements in lavish accommodation. I'll be very evasive with my language there. That was done as a contingency. It was this. Basically, it's the repeat. By the way, everything they do is a formula. Their blueprints, they repeat them, because why change something that works, right? Why change a winning formula? We saw the same thing with the Sea Peoples and the late Bronze Age collapse, which ultimately destroyed the entire Middle Eastern theatre. Basically, every civilization there, bar Egypt, was completely consumed by these Sea Peoples, this confederation which overturned the entire civilization there. A similar thing will occur here with Europe, of course, and then they'll get rid of Esau, this lineage, and they believe that they'll bring in a world government for themselves, a kingdom. This is why, by the way, you see with Henry Kissinger, to his dying day, he fought zealously and was endeavouring on all levels to pursue this agenda, because again, he has that fire in him. This is a religion. It's a mystery religion. You see that for the likes of the popes and all of these various religions, which fundamentally are all of the one religion, the one mystery religion, because they were created by a singular sort of philosopher priest class who probably in the days of yore viewed the stars and saw the celestial cycles, saw the cycles of nature, and then simply projected those cycles onto man himself, and then established this pattern of civilization. Or perhaps, of course, it is as they say, they came from another world, right? They are actually not of this planet, which some of them seem to intimate, and not just seem, I mean, they directly say it. There's certain priests of certain sects, should we say, that they outrightly state it, that they are not of this line, that they, through genetic manipulation, they established these vessels for themselves. And this also ties in with their extremely obsessive focus on genealogy. They believe that when they reincarnate, they want to maintain through the purity of their line. In their belief, this leads to their spirit being more probabilistically inclined towards, I guess, reincarnating into this pure vessel of that line. This is also done, by the way, in a more physical sense through ethical wills, which is something very unique to them. And these ethical wills, essentially, it's a sort of way to retain, or it's inheritance retention, where the inheritance is only released to the inheritor if they maintain a strict pattern of behaviour, if they maintain, in this sense, perseverance with the agenda. So it's released in piecemeal, so that they can never just simply excuse themselves from pursuing the agenda. So it maintains a strict adherence, again, ethical adherence in that sense to the agenda. But they also believe that when reincarnation comes about once they die, that if they maintain these strict, pure genealogical lines, that they'll more easily reincarnate into these vessels. That's another thing that they mention too. Again, this is all very strange and alien to us, because normal people, they breed in common, right? They don't necessarily care for who they breed with, but these individuals do. But digressing, getting back to all of this, you're seeing in Britain, for example, this fervent push, and I think the individual's name was Bates, or Betts. He's an analyst at King's College in London, on specifically irregular warfare, propaganda, counter-insurgency techniques, of course, right? And he's now doing the rounds, talking about the coming civil war in Britain, in that we're primed for civil war and we're teetering on the precipice of civil war. This is all by design, right? These individuals don't just come out of King's College London and start talking about that, we're now on the precipice of civil war, and then they go viral, and they get everyone clamouring for it, they get everyone familiarised with this, almost socially primed. That's the term I use. It's also predictive programming, that's another term, but I use the term social priming, and I did make a distinction in my first book between the two. Of course, that's exactly what you're seeing with that individual who is talking about civil war, and now everyone else is talking about it as well. This is how these things work, this seeding of narratives. And it occurs in the mainstream, and of course it occurs in the alternative media as well. And this is all really to establish a labyrinth, puzzling of the mind. And this labyrinth and the fear of the Minotaur, which is of course always behind you, right? You have to constantly be in fear. It sort of propels you forth down a funneled path, involuntarily, and in a very autonomous or, unconscious way. So you almost inhabit a dream, or a dreamscape, where the dream master is the systems of power, and they furnish the dream for you, and you're merely this sort of unthinking husk that has no agency of its own, that is completely propelled and compelled down certain paths that have been pre-designed for this said husk, the dreamer. So this is exactly how propaganda works. But of course, they've completely hollowed out the culture of Britain. I mean, that's undeniable at this point. They hollowed out the culture of the Scots as well, previous to hollowing out the culture of England and the English. And of course the same was done for the Welsh and the Irish too. Always quite laughable to me that Ireland threw off the yoke of England, yet all the Irish speak English, and they've, by and large, they've abandoned Gaelic. Totally abandoned it. And the same, of course, was done in Scotland. We never threw off the yoke of the English. We were never militarily conquered. We were conquered through finance and the Bank of England, and of course the absolutely insane Darien scheme, which was a huge ruse. I think 25% of all currency in Scotland at the time went on this one scheme, which was largely half-baked. And of course, who could have predicted it? The Scottish economy tanked. We basically had to default. We were insolvent as a country, and then we were completely subsumed into England not long after, with the Act of the Union, I believe in 1706, but it was ratified in Scotland in 1707. But I mean, even prior to that, our culture was being diluted quite extensively by just by the erosion of beginning with the folk religion and Christianization that ultimately destroyed the last vestiges of the Druids. And of course they had to get rid of the Druids because it's in the name, really. It stems from a Proto-Indo-European word which links with Gnosis. So they were the Gnostics, right? They were the people who had knowledge of the hereafter and what existence was about. And they understood the sort of spirits, the powers and principalities, the darkness of this world that sought to come out of their tenebrous caves and to colonize the world, to immerse it in this universal and extremely militant darkness. That this was a darkness of ignorance. That's what they seek to bring man into, so that he can never fully understand who he is or what his power truly is. And it's to make man an island. Everything that they do is to destroy the culture, to hollow out everything, reduce it down, again, which is part of the alchemical great work, the first stage, Negredo, to putrefy it down to its base essence. And then from that, of course, they can atomize all of man and then more easily control him in that manner. It's a reason as well that short-form content and also the terrible nutrition too in the diets has become rather ubiquitous now, because they don't desire man to emerge from the egg, to emerge from the cave, to emerge from his immersion, his congenital state of amnesia. They don't want that, because as soon as that happens en masse, they fail. And this is why as well they want man locked into a surrealist world. It really, of course, has found its nascent stages in the likes of the artificial sense organ of the scrying mirror, the iPhone, or the Android, the smartphone. And through this scrying mirror, they have created this artificial Ahrimanic state, this sort of unconscious shadow realm, this abyss that people consistently stare into, and it creates an almost surrealist dream world for them. And of course, after a while, they become conditioned to this surrealist experience, and that bleeds into the real world to such a point that most adults become perpetual children. They never grow up. They play dress up. They have, rather strange and non-normative issues. So there's a sort of bleed over effect that occurs with this virtual reality. But the virtual reality is entirely what they want man plugged into and interfacing with. They want a brain-computer interface. Do you ever notice that the technologies, the more that they advance, they become closer and closer to one's mind? They grow ever closer to us. They seek to attach themselves to us, almost as extensions of us, as a new digital limb. And of course this will be brought into a mass inventorization through the Internet of all things. And their demiurge was called the Lord of all things. In days gone by, the Lord of the earth was named that. That was an appellation that he went by, the Lord of all things. You also see this as well with the trident, I believe it's called the Trebuza of Ukraine. And of course it's on the background of the blue and yellow, which combined create green. The green is the colour of spiritual unripeness, of decomposition of this world, of the demiurge. And just to be very broad about it. And that Trebuza, or that trident, links with, of course, 2 Kings 21:7, the name of the Lord is etched into Jerusalem. It also mentions it's etched into your heart, I believe, as well. Again, you have the 3 ventricles, you have the shin letter, which is the sort of W letter, etched into Jerusalem. You have the Trishula of Shiva. This goes back to the Asuras, and my new book will detail this, but you also have the Lord of the Earth of Poseidon, and his name itself etymologically is a compound from Attic Greek, which means, you guessed it, Lord of the Earth. He also has the trident. What that is depicting, like the 3 faces of the Asuras as well, you also have Hecate, the goddess of the underworld. Janus is another deity of several faces or many faces, a god of thresholds, time. Ultimately is the 3 thresholds of time. It is the tripartite essence of time, past, present and future. And whenever, and you see this of course most pronouncedly in the Norse mythology, whenever the primordial abyss was tamed and brought into manifestable conscious reality, pre-tangible reality that is, when the abyss was intellectualized by the patriarch or fatherly head of the pantheon, it was always done in a triad. It was always a triad. Zoroastrianism, of course, has a triad too. Ahura Mazda, Mithra, and I believe that her name is Apamnapat. Apamnapat, I believe is her name. It means child of water, I believe. So the water is feminine for obvious reasons. You're born from the birth canal. Your mother's waters break before you are born. The semiotics behind this, I think, links to the Asuras. The Asuras were claimed to be a merchant elite by several Indian historians, both contemporary and historical. And the Asuras, or Nagas, they were representative of that merchant elite, but that merchant elite was a maritime power as well. And there was a great battle that occurred between them and the Aryans. This is what's mentioned by several Indian historians. One that comes to mind, of course, is Kutakat Purushottama Chon, and he wrote a very interesting book called Remedy the Frauds in Hinduism, which came out in 1991. So the Aryans, he states, were unable to defeat the Asuras directly. So what they had to do was defeat them in a sort of irregular manner by destroying their infrastructure and hurting them in their coin purse, essentially, to deplete their coffers. This eventually led the pre-Abrahamic cult that he states here under Lord Brahma. I think it's probably under Shiva, or a deity that was a sort of proto-Shiva deity. Pashupati seems to be a potential candidate. In the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization, that these asuras then went westward. This is why you have the complete inversion of the asuras and the devas. One that is referred to as good. In Hinduism, that's the devas. In Zoroastrianism, that's the asuras. And then, of course, the devas are considered completely evil in Zoroastrianism. But as mentioned, they are the good in Hinduism. And the asuras are the evil ones in Hinduism. Likewise. So you see this complete inversion. Then you go even further westward and you see Enki in Sumeria, literally the Lord of the Earth, En, Lord, Ki, Earth. And then that was transliterated into this Semitic Akkadian as Ea, which was pronounced Ya. And then, of course, that went even further westward with the Amorites, or also known as the Babylonians, and with the Hyksos, who were also called the Amu or Amar. They're all Amorites. They're from Syria, right? Syria, Assyria, which probably derive, again, Eastern Syria, but also derives perhaps from what the Asura term or appellation actually meant, which was Ushra. So Ushra was the East. It also was linked to the dawn for obvious reasons, right? The dawn rises in the East. So the dawn is heralded in the East. The sun rises in the East, sets in the West. This also ties in as well with everything surrounding their eschatology. You can pick any single mystery religion that has descended from Kabbalah in an intellectual or mystical manner. And it's all the same. It's all about the son of the sun. You see that of Marduk or Amarutu, the Amorites' chief deity, who later was known as Bel Marduk, and then that was abbreviated merely to Baal. He was also known as Bel Shaddai, the Lord who sits upon the mountain. That's what the Shaddai part means. Shaddai. It doesn't mean Lord Almighty. No, not at all. If you look at it etymologically, from the Akkadian, Shaddai meant of the mountain. So it's literally the Lord of the mountain. Of course, El Shaddai is the god of the mountain, the El of the mountain. El is, of course, linked with Saturn. It's the Canaanite or Levantine, or of course Phoenician as well, equivalent of Saturn. The deity who sat in heaven, the deity who lorded over Baal. And you see that with the Baal epic cycle and such, and Baal, I believe, overturns Yam, the sea god, who, again, you see this with Marduk and overturning Tiamat. It's this idea that the fresh water mixed with the salt water and birthed land. That's the sort of mid-Eastern ancient idea of creation. Of course, it exists as well within Hinduism. It all comes from Hinduism and the pre-Vedic religion that existed there, it seems at least. But this Asura became Ahura with the Ahura Mazda, right? The Ahuric triad. You go even further westward, you can imagine that it also became the Akkadian Ea, Ya, and then of course just simply Ya, and then eventually Yahweh. So you can see the connections here. It's not just, it can't merely just be explained away as coincidence. There's some sort of, even if it is tentative, there is some sort of connective tissue here, conceptually, that's rooted in the deities, in the names, and even as well in the priest class, in their hierarchical structure, in the eschatology, in the various myths as well. So there is a connection there, definitely. And if we look at the Old Testament, Isaiah 14:12, it states, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer," or literally the morning star, the light bringer, son of the morning, or son of the dawn. How art thou cut down to the ground, who didst weaken the nations, or another way of saying it is, you have been cut down to the ground, you who held low or laid low the nations, right? You've fallen from heaven. What did the Asuras do? They got drunk and they fell from Mount Meru, which is the equivalent of the Dharmic heaven of Sumeru. Well, there's Sumeru again, right? Sumeru, and then you have the Sumerians. Very, very interesting. The Sumerians, by the way, were not native to that region. They are said to have come from the east, through the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the one theory is that they came from Bahrain. But I mean, yes, but was Bahrain just merely a sort of trading post? For what we know was trade coming from the Gujarati Peninsula and the Harappan civilization, or the Indus Valley civilization. So what you're reading there in Isaiah 14:12 are the Asuras. Lucifer, O morning star, right? The light bringer, the son of the dawn. Remember, Asura etymologically may derive from Ushra, which means east or dawn. Very, very, very interesting. So what they're saying there, how you have fallen from heaven, O light bringers, the sons of the Asuras, or literally just the Asuras, even the light bringers are the Asuras. How you have been cut to the ground, you who laid low the nations. What they mean by that is the Asuras and the Nagas were a maritime power in the ancient times. This is what several historians have mentioned. Again, contemporary and historical. They were a maritime power. This is why everything surrounds maritime things. You have Atlantis, which perhaps was in Mauritania, the land of the Moors, the Amorites, America, which is the Latin name for Brittany, where the Jacobin society, the Jacobin society, orchestrated and planned the French Revolution in the mid-18th century onwards. So you have all of these connections. Another one, by the way, is the Mother of Darkness Castle. Its French name is Château de Amagua, which has no translation in French bar the Chateau of the Amorish, or the Amorish, or literally Castle of the Amorites. So you have all of this. It's everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And the Amorites were the old Babylonian, or the founders of the old Babylonian Empire, rather. So all of this is based around this sort of Babylonian idea, which even the name Bab-El, the gateway of El, or literally, as I've stated, El is Saturn, the gateway of Saturn, the gate of Saturn, the doors of Saturn, the doors of time, of thresholds, of controlling the cycles. This is what these Babylonians, those who use rhetoric in Babylon, in their little think tanks, and of course within their platitudinous speeches, through their puppets, vicariously through their puppets, to the public as well. These Babylonians or Amorites, this is exactly what they have done throughout the ages wherever they've cropped up. They had this idea that they were a great power, that they are people of the dawn, and we are people of the West, right? They want to destroy the people of the West because we are the people of the sunset, of the twilight. All of this is completely symbolic. And as I've mentioned, with the trident of Ukraine, and then of the blue and the yellow establishing the green, none of this is by accident. This is all about a harvest. It's a mass harvest. Make no qualms about it. Furthermore as well, the Asura may link with the Akkadian, the Anzu or Anshu bird, right? Literally the heavenly owl. So An, which is heavenly Anu, the sky, the heaven, and then the Shu, which is the owl, can also just mean generally a bird, but it's clear that it means the heavenly owl because, well, look at their symbolism. They still use the owls today. The Bohemian Grove, for example. Or, of course, on the $1 bill. There's a little owl perched there. Very hidden. And, of course, we can't fail to mention, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention this, the Washington, D.C. street plan. You've got an owl placed there as well. You've got other things placed there. But one major glaring symbol is that of an owl. No one has ever been able to crack that within the conspiracy circles. But that's what it is. It's harkening back to this Promethean or Luciferian character in the Sumerian myth called Anshu, who stole the tablet of destinies from the gods so that he could become the most powerful, that he could tell the future, that he could control time. And who is Anshu also related to? Abu. He's sometimes syncretized with him. Abu. Ab. A-B. Abraham. Right? These ideas. Abram. So Abu literally means the father of the harvest or the father of the pastures. This links with this notion that we see form from the agricultural revolution of agrarian systematization. That's what I call it. This is the beginnings of managerialism, where the human farmer controls the human cattle. He selectively breeds the human cattle. He corrals the human cattle down certain behavioural lines of thinking and patterns of behaviour. Again, he becomes a human farmer by capturing and reining in the crops, by controlling the crops, by controlling the cycles, the seasons, to funnel crops selectively down a patterned outcome of harvest. These farmers, who were the sort of nascent human farmers, believed that a similar thing could be done with the likes of the human agricultural system of civilization, which civilization is the systematic domestication of the human being, where you begin to view the human being not as having any intrinsic worth individually, but as a collective to be exploited, as a mass. This is where you get the idea of massification from, that of course we see throughout our modern world. This is why you have the likes of the terms of social capital, human resources, herd immunity, herd thinking, herd mentality. All of this is, it surrounds that crux. It surrounds that concept, rather, of agrarian systematization. And the reason for human farming and the reason for civilization. And that surrounds that concept of agrarian systematization as it pertains to human civilization. Again, as a means of domestication of the entire species by an informed minority who are aware of the game that they are playing, of the game that they are rigging. So that's exactly what that means. And this is about them getting back to a resumption where they could lay low the nations, right? That they reach heaven, that they colonize heaven. Why do you think they were building a Tower of Babel? It's because they wanted to perforate the firmament, and in a metaphorical sense, and to reach heaven, to literally colonize heaven. It's the same thing with Yuval Noah Harari's Internet of All Things. That it won't just be this world, it won't just be man that is merged into this machine system. It will be the entirety of the galaxy. They want a celestial empire, because it's about reaching heaven from where the Asuras fell, from where the quote-quote fallen angels had fallen from, where Lucifer, or the morning star, had fallen from, and assuming control of heaven to become gods themselves, the Homo Deus, the God-men. Now, this also has an individualistic, spiritual message as well. The idea that we all came from the East, what that means is that we all are fragments of God. We travelled to the West to seek that which was lost. And then, of course, we will return to the East once we have found that which was lost, once we have awoken from our amnesia, our sort of spiritual captivity, our spiritual involution, as Jung called it. But that's not what they believe. The way they've twisted this is that they want a materialistic redemption. A redemption through sin. A redemption through immortality, through becoming gods themselves. They want to return to Eden, to break back into Eden, and eat from the tree of life as well. To become the full synthesis of that triad, of the good, the evil, and the life. Or, pardon me, the knowledge of the good, the evil, and the life. So, that's fundamentally what this is all about. And yes, so Abu, the father of the pastures, this is found as well with the likes of the Satyr Repotenet Opera Rotas, which in its Latin etymology and phraseology means, and I say Latin because a repo isn't a Latin word, it's potentially an abbreviated Latin word, but that ties in with another alternative translation of this, which is more scientific and less philosophical. But with Satyr Repotenet Opera Rotas, the arepo can also be the Sanskrit arepas, which means to be of both of good and evil, or actually possessing no knowledge of good and evil. To be almost nihilistic in a sense, in that way. So Satyr Repotenet Opera Rotas, the seeder, who is without knowledge of good or evil, manipulates the wheel via care or skill. Another way to translate it is, if we assume that the Satyr Repotenet Opera Rotas was actually written from right to left, as we see with, of course, the Hebrew and Semitic scripts, and wherever we find these Satyr squares or Rotas squares, we see that there was a Jewish population there, usually. For example, Pompeii, there was a Jewish population there, and they even believe that potentially that Satyr square that was found in Pompeii was probably found in the Jewish quarters of Pompeii. They've even found, of course, villas of Jewish Roman citizens. in Pompeii. So we see with rotas, opera, tenet, sator, arepo, that what that may mean in a more scientific or even arcane scientific sense, that the seeder or the divine creator, repeating from beginning to end, again ad repo, but they simply took the D away so it could fit into this. So it's sort of broken Latin, which of course you would expect of a foreign aligned group. So in that sense, the divine sower from A repeating to O, arepo, the divine sower from alpha repeatedly to omega ad infinitum, comprehends and works with toroidal vortexes. Now, this gets into a whole different slew of things. But the hourglass, that is the minimum orbital atomic structure to create a toroidal moment. And the toroidal moment itself produces a ring of toroids, almost like the zodiacal signs, the zodiacal wheel. I believe it's also in denominations of 12 too, which is interesting. So 12 and 24, they are numbers that constantly crop up with this toroidal moment. But each of those toroids in the wheel of toroids, the wheel formation of the toroid, each of the toroids that comprise that wheel themselves are comprised of toroids, and they're stacked in alternating vertical and horizontal toroids after each iteration, or going into each microcosmic level of the toroid. And it's homeostatic, it's autopoietic, it's self-regulating. It continues itself. Of course, it's still finite, but it continues just by its own homeostatic nature. The way that it functions, the quality of it. So this is what this is. The yin-yang is tied in with this. By the way, look at Extinction Rebellion. Look at that. It's the same structure, the hourglass shape, or the figure of 8, the solar analemma. The hourglass is linked to Saturn because he is the father of time. We also have as well, again with the Anshu and Abu, they were also linked with Ninurta, which was Saturn in the Sumerian and of course Akkadian mythologies. So Anshu, Lucifer, the morning star, Ushra, Asura, they all have connections back to Saturn and time and thresholds. None of this is by accident. None of it is new. But yeah, digressing, that's why they require this war as well. It's to maintain control over the populations. I mentioned all of this, by the way, in my first book. I mentioned it 3 years ago now, in 2020 when the Russo-Ukraine war started. This is also to finish off Esau, to get all of the Europeans massacring each other in this sort of pointless fratricidal war. It's designed to deplete the social capital, finally deplete it to almost zero, so that they can bring to bear on the world this great work and fulfill it. And yeah, I have to admit, I hold back on a lot of what I know, because a few years back when I was mentioning the sort of ins and outs of all of this, what's coming down the pipe, and I wasn't mincing words, a lot of people stated that I was fear-mongering. And believe you me, I'm not. What I'm stating to you is, it's actually a sort of happy spin on it. And I'm doing that because if I was to provide you the entirety of what I know and of what I've read in the books of the mystery religion and the big boys, it would honestly terrify you. would terrify you. And I'm cognizant of that. The vast majority may still be going through a process of awakening, a satori, a self-realization of what this world is about, the nature of it, the quality of existence, the quality of the systems of power. And people have asked me before, well, how do you know all of this? It's such a secretive conspiracy. How do you know all of this? Why would they publish it in their books? Because they know the vast majority are functionally illiterate. That's why. They know the vast majority of people don't read. Though they perhaps can read to an average level, and they've got a bit of mental aptitude, they know the vast majority won't. Because it's difficult to do that. A lot of people don't have enough time. They're in a sort of a constant, incessant process of wage slavery that saps their energy until they're little more than a sun-dried raisin of a human being. And they've also got distractionism, which fires up the dopamine centers and those feel-good endorphins far more than, of course, reading a book would, especially reading a book on heavy topics such as this. See, the thing is, when I'm talking about this, I don't find it that it's not a heavy topic to me. I really started my studies with military history. So when I'm viewing this, I'm just viewing this from the point of view of a strategist, of a military commander, if you will. What would I do? That's or I look at it like, oh, well, that's interesting. How are they using that to control this social group, that social group? How is this coming together in a sort of social mechanism for their agenda to thus be fired up, for their agenda to thus be fulfilled? So I'm looking at it very impartially. I'm almost looking at it dispassionately too. And that is completely intentional. Even the way that I come across on the videos, it's not meant to be a Debbie Downer. It's to be completely dispassionate. Because what we're doing here isn't infotainment. It's quite serious. It has real world implications. And if you do not understand at least a smattering of this, of what they desire, of the system that they're attempting to bring in, then, I mean, we have no hope. You have to reach a certain threshold of individuals in the population for it to become a general, not a general consensus, but a general understanding within the zeitgeist. A concept that's, well trodden, a concept that's fairly normative to speak about. I mean, we're still trying to get to that stage. So, as well, I know that, before the end of this civilizational epoch with the West, you're going to have some sort of global conflagration. And of course, we will have domestic conflagrations, especially in Western Europe. Western Europe, in terms of their political establishments, will not survive this. It's just a fact. The Western economy will collapse too. I mean, you're maybe 10, 15 years away from that at the most, at a maximum. Because they're rapidly developing this agenda, and they're rapidly seeking to realise the ambitions that have been age-old. So we're seeing an acceleration, and the reason for the acceleration, because there is, in parallel, an accelerated decline in the cognitive capabilities of the population. We've been dumbed down to such a degree that they damn well know there's very little that stands in their way. We're honestly like lemmings at this point. We're like hyper-domesticated sheep. We really are. I mean, you could kill one of the herd and the herd will not react. I mean, look what's happening, for example, in Britain. You've got all of this rise in crime. The cost of living is going through the roof. Just there, you've had the new Labour budget attempt to cut the welfare of disabled people and, push them back into work. Couple that with they cut the winter fuel payments, or winter fuel subsidies rather, to the elderly people, those who no longer work or cannot work, because they're too frail, old and infirm. And moreover as well, they've just cut the subsidies and incentives to farmers, which allows farmers to balance their budgets between, the growing seasons. And at the same time, if that wasn't a sort of nod, wink, wink signal to where they want to take agriculture and farming, they have also just rescinded the mental health support, the free mental health support given to farmers as well. So, moreover as well, of course, BlackRock is all behind this. This is to essentially monopolise and privatise all of the farms. You need to have this, or they'll lose in a revolution. Again, if they can just... They understand this, but before I get to that, BlackRock have also lobbied the Labour government in the UK, which is our equivalent of the Democrats. It's sort of far left, but I mean, it doesn't really matter. Both parties are entirely the same. They lobbied them to de facto price the inheritors of farms out of the market vis-a-vis stupendously high inheritance tax. Again, so it goes into the state's possession after that generation of farmers die, and then the state can work with BlackRock to then corporatise and quote-quote privatise all of this, right? It's not really privatising, it's more corporatising, to corporatise it. But they know this, that if there was a rebellion by the nativistic majority, that they would lose simply because the nativist populist element could simply sabotage pretty much unguarded infrastructural installations. They could cause complete havoc in the urban centres, which aren't self-sufficient. They rely upon the rural areas, these farming communities, to provide them with the food and necessities they need so they can stave off pure anarchic savagery and chaos. They have stated, the likes of the Pentagon and also the Ministry of Defence here, some of the studies they've taken, that this nativist, populist, dissident group or rebel movement could simply sit in the farms and guard the farms and just deny both infrastructure and food to the urban areas and, de facto gain victory over the urban centres in this sort of war that's beginning to... It's a very cold war right now that's beginning to present itself as a war between the urban sentiment and the rural sentiment. And again, that's found throughout all of the various fault lines that divide the two, religion being a major one. The rural areas still want to maintain their religious outlook. The urban areas do not. This is very, very reflective of that of the Christian religion in its very formative and nascent stages in the early centuries AD, but it was purely an urban phenomenon. In fact, you can see it was an urban phenomenon because they call the heretics pagans, which comes from the Latin paganus, which means literally quite literally rural folks, the people who live in the among the heather, and out in the fields and what have you. In fact, that's where heathen comes from as well. So it's those who are country people, who are yokels, if you will, which is a sort of derogatory term. So this all surrounds this desire of the cabal to bring people in to the confines of the city and to detach them fully, to detach man fully from nature. That is it. That is ultimately their plan. They believe all progress can only happen in cities. And all they have to do is iron out the chinks in this armour, and then it will be completely impenetrable. It will be an unassailable height by which this system can just be self-perpetuating, autopoietic, homeostatic. But what the cyberneticists desired and what they spoke of in the early 20th century, beginning with Norbert Wiener and then going on from there to the point where you have the likes of, I believe his name's Francis Halligan. He's a third-order cyberneticist, and he talks about the global brain, again echoing these sentiments of the likes of the Internet of all things and things such as that. And the reason they hide all of this in plain sight is because who would listen to them? If they even relayed what they had read in these books, they wouldn't believe it, because to believe it is to literally take the pin and burst their own bubble, which then flings them out into the big wide world, and the big wide world is scary. So this is why governments have maintained their positions of power, because they keep the scary away. They are the guide within the labyrinth, and they keep one away from the Minotaur if you just simply follow their instructions, right? To the letter, without question, without flinching, to make sure your thinking is regimented, then you'll be safe. And again, it's all about safety and security. That is the proclamation and promise of all tyrants, and it's the creed of slaves. I know these people have absolutely no empathy. They see themselves totally as a different species. I mean, that's evident from their behaviour and their rhetoric. Even their puppets, the rhetoric of their puppets, their mouthpieces. Of course, they're complete and utter cold calculating machines of a binary deity, of a god that is more machine than he is divine, and he exists on the end, or the hinter area of time. He's at the end of history. He writes all of history. He is the beginning and the end, this notion, right? He is part of the cycle. He is the fomenter of cycles, the fomenter of time, the fomenter of discord, and the Anglo-Metes, right? So I'm not in the business of second-guessing them. If what they're stating seems to be occurring in front of my eyes, then that is the case, right? That is the case. You can only go on the evidence of your eyes and what you see in front of you, right? And if I'm reading it and it's providing me the explanation from the horse's mouth, so to speak, it is the case. I'm almost 95% sure it's the case. That's my principles of deduction. And this idea that history is fake and all, absolutely. I'm not saying history hasn't been written and rewritten like every religion and every holy book. But ultimately, there is a crux of truth in all of these histories. Like the media itself, they spin it. They don't simply just write it, from complete thin air. A lot of it is it's spun. They're spun stories. It's almost a way of taking the memories of the event and then through successive generations and indoctrination, skewing the perception of that event. So it's not necessarily creating the event and then having to establish a perception of an event that didn't happen, but it's simply the skewing of the event. Even these notions that everything is fake, I mean, that's not how conspiracies work. Conspiracies work by maintaining that closed knowing or knowledge of the illusion that the conspiracy is putting forth, of the goals that the conspiracy is attempting to reach, of the events the conspiracy is attempting to foist onto the world. Again, if you have these events that are all fake, right, that doesn't make sense, because then you're growing the knowledge of the fakery to such a degree that more and more of the concentric rings that radiate out from that inner sanctum of all knowledge of the actual conspirators, the origin point of the conspiracy, you sort of radiate it out, you extend it out to such a degree that eventually the conspiracy would fall apart. It would get out, somebody would leak it. Especially, by the way, in individualised societies, which we're still in nominally. We don't have this sort of collectivised sense of the world like what they have in, say, East Asia. They're more in line with that view of the world. We are far more individualistic in the way that we view the world. So, thus, we have a greater sense of personal morality, personal ethics, as opposed to ethics or morality that is based around the collective or what the regime wants or what have you. So there is that as well. I mean, there's that issue with it. But what you're seeing in Syria, make no qualms about it, that's coming to the entirety of the world, especially the West. You have been selected for extirpation. Again, whether there's a valid historical reason for it or not, which I would argue there is none. It's basically just a way for them to justify their own immoral actions, which is fundamentally what all religion and religious dogma is for. And they believe they're completely moral, by the way, what they're doing. They believe it has a moral justification, that is a moral necessity. The extirpation of the entirety of Western Europe. And, Europe as a whole, really. I mean, you see the Slavic Civil War and the Russo-Ukraine conflict. So, yes, their agents are in every single government, and they're fomenting war and essentially perma-crisis. That's another way they maintain control. Everything is a crisis. We're immersed in constant fear, right? We're uneasy all the time. There's a great trepidation in the European peoples and the peoples globally, right? And they project onto their victims their own iniquities, their own crimes, because that's the way that criminals function. It's the way that they justify it to themselves and their own psychopathic mentality. So yeah, I mean, fundamentally that is the agenda at play. So yeah, you're about maybe 5 or 10 years off for them to get into a position, at least in Western Europe, to have the final sort of push to get rid of the unwanted elements. I think they call them the wicked. We are called the wicked in the Zohar. So once the wicked have been completely removed from the world, that once they have a world to themselves, that they can basically shake off the shackles of the instructions in the holy texts. To provide one example of this, in a contemporary Kabbalistic work by Gershom Scholem, who is a very famous contemporary Kabbalistic scholar, and in his work, The Messianic Ideas, if you type that in, it will come up. I'm not going to mention the rest of the name of it. because it may be picked up. He states, this is from page 39 to 40, quote, "The Zohar follows Talmudic Agada in seeing redemption not as the product of inward progress in the historical world, but as a supernatural miracle involving the gradual illumination of the world by the light of the Messiah. It begins with an initial gleam and ends with the full revelation, the light of the Messiah. At the time when the Holy One, blessed be He, shall set Israel upright and bring them up out of Galut." Galut is the notion of Exodus. It's the literal process, the ongoing process of Exodus. So once that ends, He will open to them a small and scant window of light, and then He will open another that is larger, until He will open to them the portals on high, to the four directions of the universe. Very interesting, because that links to Naram's sin, being the king of the four corners of the world, or the four sides of the world. And even this notion of the portals on high, right, like Babel, the Tower of Babel. Babel is, of course, from the Akkadian, quite literally the gate of the gods, the gateway of the gods, the portal of the gods. Or in the case of the Akkadian, the Semitic language, the gateway to El, or the gateway of El, the gateway of Saturn. So we're getting back to the Saturnian Golden Age and all of this. El is the equivalent of Saturn in the Canaanite, Levantine, and general pan-Semitic theology. So continuing on, "So shall it be with all that the Holy One, blessed be He, does for Israel and for the righteous among them." That term, Holy One, blessed be He, that's taken straight from the Zohar, by the way. "So shall it be, and not at a single instant, for neither does healing come to a sick man at a single instant, but gradually until he is made strong." So the process will be gradual, the agenda will be gradual. And then he states this: "The Gentiles who are designated Esau or Edom, however, will suffer the opposite fate. They received their light in this world at a single stroke, but it will depart from them gradually until Israel shall grow strong and destroy them. And when the spirit of uncleanliness shall pass from the world, and the divine light shall shine upon Israel without let or hindrance, all things will return to their proper order, to the state of perfection which prevailed in the Garden of Eden before Adam sinned. The world will all be joined, the worlds will all be joined." This is the idea of the four worlds concept in Kabbalah. "Will all be joined one to another, and nothing will separate creator from creature. All will rise upward by a sense of the Spirit, and creatures will be purified until they behold the Shekinah eye to eye." This is literally the feminine indwelling presence of the Lord. It's interesting because Kabbalah actually stresses a dualistic, or a duality to God, or to whatever the hell they're worshipping, this Lord character. But of course, in Abrahamism, just in general, the duality of the divine is strictly sacrilegious, and it's verboten to even think that. Which, of course, puts Kabbalah in that sense theologically in contention with Abrahamism in general, in terms of the exoteric Abrahamic thread of thinking. Just a bit of trivia there. And then it states this: "In the last section of the Zohar, this prophecy is supplemented by another foretelling, the liberation of Israel from all the limitations which the yoke of the Torah, or the instructions, has laid upon her in Galut," or again the ongoing process of Exodus and diaspora. The author expresses his vision in the imagery of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, from which death depends. Since Adam sinned, the world has been governed by the tree of life. Not by the tree of life, as it properly should be, but by the tree of knowledge. The tree of life is entirely and exclusively holy, with no admixture of evil, and then he goes on to basically state the same thing as I've told you regarding what they desire is immortality. The tree of life concept, by the way, that's jotted down there by Gershom Scholem, that is what he's doing there, is an exposition through symbolism of the desire for immortality. That is the promise. That is the promise that's laid bare in the Zohar. It's the promise that's laid bare even in the Old Testament as well. It's the promise that's laid bare in every single mystery school that has, of course, cascaded or descended from Kabbalah. You honestly couldn't write this. It's utterly insane. But they wholeheartedly believe this promise, and they're working towards it feverishly and zealously. They believe they're going to be literal gods upon earth, immortal beings that will have biological distinctions from the lower plebeian class of the still extant Erev Rav of the server class. Every single idea they have of utopia, it's all a very simplistic class structure that's presented. You will have the world, the servers, the servitors, and then above them you will have the enforcers, and above them you will have the philosopher priest kings of a specific super dynasty, the secret line of Moshe, right? They also call themselves the learned elders or the wise elders. So, I mean, ultimately that's what they're desirous of. That's the system they're desirous of. And we'll get into it, or I do get into it within my book. Basically, they believe this is a resumption of the world order which they had, but they lost it because they came so close, but they just missed the mark, right? Like the Greek equivalent of sin, or the Greek etymological root of the English concept of sin, which is amartia, literally to miss the mark, right? So they missed the mark. And what they believe they're in right now is similar to the relationship that the CCP has with Taiwan. That, according to official policy, the CCP has de jure suzerainty over Taiwan. It is part of their territorial sphere of influence. However, and of course their territorial jurisdiction. However, of course, Taiwan exists in this limbo state where they are a temporary rebel, if you will, on the hinterland of China, of the CCP's domain. It's a similar thing here. They believe wholeheartedly that the entirety of the world is wicked. They're in a rebellious state against their rightful world order, their celestial and divine and holy world order, which, though lost control of these rebels, it nonetheless claims de jure suzerainty over the entirety of the world. Everything in it, in the oceans, on land, in the sky, they believe that they own it all, that it is part of their world order. And what they're seeking to do is get themselves into a place, get the geopolitical stage into a place, get the entire world into a position, a place where it can then be transitioned back into this world order where they reign supreme over basically the ashes that will remain, and an extremely small population will remain as well. that will just, again, serve them and act as enforcers. Eventually, though, there will be a synthetic species that comes along. All of this is feudalistic. This is entirely what feudalism was based on. So you will have the oratores, which are the priests, the intelligentsia, and you could say the kingly class as well, though they are, you could say, underlings of the priests and the intelligentsia. The intelligentsia and the priest, philosopher class, they choose the kings. The kings act as sort of masks to the true power, the true inner sanctum. So you have the oratores, and then below them you will have the bellatores, which are those of war. Bella, meaning of war. Like the casus belli, right? The reason for war, the justification for war, the case for war. So you will have the bellatores, those are the enforcer class. Of course, the kings can be part of that as well. Kings usually take on a role as being the commanders-in-chief, the warriors. That's what Trump is, by the way. Trump is the commander-in-chief of the underling class of the bellatores, the enforcer class, who governs Ben Salem, but Ben Salem itself bows to Jerusalem. That is what the prophecy was, and it's the entirety of the reason that Ben Salem, or the New Atlantis, what we now know as the United States of America, it's the reason for its founding. Manly P. Hall states that as well in Secret Destinies of America. Again, this is all hidden in plain sight, because they know the vast majority don't really read. And even if, of course, people did read this and then attempted to, broadcast it to anyone else, the vast majority would just simply scoff at them. They would ostracize them as a lunatic, because this sounds like pure lunacy. I'm reading this off the page, it sounds like lunacy, but it's not, it's very much real. This is what basically a small scintilla of the world population, of this informed minority, this is what they seek for the future. As Charles Galton Darwin mentioned, for the next 1,000,000 years. I mean, they think this will go into perpetuity. All cultures, all religions, everything will cease once these individuals get themselves into a position where they can unveil and foist onto the world a conflagration of such a catastrophe, such magnitude, that they believe will bring about this prophecy, this eschatology, where they will transition from this world of limitation to a world of the golden age, right? A world of Saturn, a world of their deity, of their archetype, of the spirit of their nation. It's always been through subversion, through irregular warfare. It has been an insurgency that has not plied its craft, that has not sought to realize its ambitions through the means of direct warfare, through using conventional armaments. No. What it has sought to do is to transition the world and to galvanize their own power base and their own resource base, their wealth, vis-a-vis subterfuge, subversion, and clandestine operations. Couple that with a complete and utter lack of empathy, you could say as well, inbreeding up the wazoo, which is a sort of British slang for, to a prodigious amount. They just cannot stop themselves. It's again, they cannot breed in common like normal people. It all has to be kept in the family. So this has, in their minds, developed neurological issues as well. So these individuals are on a completely different wavelength to the vast majority. They don't even empathize with the vast majority. You're little more than cattle to them. To, pawns, not even pawns really, on the chessboard. You're things to be trampled. There's no intrinsic worth to you in their mindset. This is why they don't care if they slaughter millions. It's nothing to them. It's like the Terminator. You can't reason with it. You can't bargain with it. There's no attempt of persuading it to course correct from its specific path that it's going down. It is seeking you out. I mean, you've quite literally been targeted for termination. Make no qualms about it. And this is probably going to be the most fiery video I've done. But it really is, quite frankly, that serious. It's an insurrectionist force. It's been waging a millennia-old insurrection against humanity itself. They seek to control humanity, to have total power over their environment and everything within it. That everything within their environment must not be an extension of God, but an extension of them, who they believe shall be apotheosized vis-a-vis biodigital convergence into this sort of new, technoistic, tyrannical God that will enclose all boundaries and will grow humans and maintain humanity in a sort of, agrarian, techno-agrarian system of pure, unadulterated and unsympathetic control. That's the truth of the matter.